The historical record shows the facts of the case were simple. Jack the Ripper's terror was defined by unprecedented speed and precision. Welcome to Mr. Nightmare. The year is 1888. This is the reality of Whitechapel, a district defined by crushing poverty and a thick industrial fog that severely complicated police work. We begin with the immediate cold reality of September 30th, the night the killer doubled down. It began around 1 a.m. A carter named Louis Diemschutz discovered the body of Elizabeth Stride in a narrow yard. Her throat had been severely cut. Police immediately understood this was a planned, brutal act. The widespread alarm that followed should have deterred any rational criminal. Instead, the killer struck again just 45 minutes later, half a mile away. Constable Edward Watkins discovered the mutilated body of Catherine Eddowes in Mitre Square. This was the double event, 2 homicides committed in under an hour, openly defying police presence and control. The methodical nature of the attack was the immediate concern. The killer had performed extensive internal injuries, suggesting a knowledge of human anatomy. This level of chilling calculation confirmed to Scotland Yard that the subject was not a random brute. They were facing an organized, arrogant individual whose timeline and methods were now actively mocking their ability to control the streets. The fog and the darkness that night were not passive elements. They were physical barriers that actively aided the perpetrator's escape and compounded the institutional failure. The cold realization was that a systematic killer was operating with impunity in the heart of London. The shock of the double event, 2 women murdered within minutes of each other, Part 1, was not the killer's ultimate victory. The victory was the environment that allowed him to move with such terrifying impunity. To understand Jack the Ripper, you must first understand Whitechapel in 1888. This was not the London of royalty and refinement. It was a district of crushing poverty, a human slum where misery was the defining characteristic. This area was the terminus for successive waves of immigration, primarily from Eastern Europe, leading to chronic overcrowding, unemployment, and disease. The living conditions were appalling. Narrow, twisting streets gave way to dark, unlit courts and alleys known as rookeries, where crime was the daily norm and desperation dictated survival. This geography was the killer's immediate and greatest accomplice. The physical layout, a labyrinth of close-set buildings and hidden passageways, guaranteed that a pursuer could be lost in seconds, providing the murderer with countless points of escape and concealment after each attack. The social conditions were the foundation of the victim's vulnerability. The women targeted by the Ripper were all marginalized figures, often forced onto the streets to earn money for a bed for the night. They lived entirely outside the protection and often the notice of conventional society. They were the invisible population, and their disappearance or death rarely sparked immediate organized alarm. When the police finally investigated, the victims often had no families to claim them, no friends to provide firm alibis, and no social status to demand a thorough, immediate investigation. This social vulnerability created the ideal hunting ground for a methodical predator who knew his targets would be found in isolated, unlit areas, and that the ensuing investigation would be hampered by the victim's social standing. The lack of social value placed on their lives meant the killer was granted a critical operational window. Compounding the physical environment was the literal atmosphere. The famous London fog of the late 19th century was not just natural moisture. It was a dense, toxic mixture of coal smoke, industrial soot, and cold air, a literal choking smog. This industrial atmosphere was the killer's constant psychological shield. The fog didn't just obscure vision, it muffled sound, isolating the narrow streets and dark courts and preventing the faint cries for help or the sounds of a struggle from reaching the distant main roads. The lighting technology of the era, weak, flickering gaslight, was entirely ineffective against this oppressive gloom, creating vast, deep shadows that devoured human figures and hid any potential witness. The fog was the perfect canvas for terror, blurring the killer's image, the subsequent confusion over descriptions, and isolating the crime, seen from the outside world. The institutional response was crippled by this combination of social and physical factors. The Metropolitan Police were trained for conventional Victorian crime, petty theft, public drunkenness, and localized brawls. They were completely unprepared for a psychological predator who targeted the most invisible segment of the population with surgical precision. The beat constables walked their routes, relying on simple foot patrol and the limited visibility of their lamps. There was no effective system for interdepartmental communication, no central database for crime patterns, and the rudimentary forensic science of the time was ill-equipped to handle the minute evidence left at the scenes. This institutional weakness, the reliance on an antiquated system to fight a modern psychological killer, was the essential ingredient that fueled the fury of the public. They knew the police were failing, but the police system was simply not built to handle a ghost who hunted in the shadows of the forgotten poor. The juxtaposition of the extreme poverty of Whitechapel and the unprecedented violence of the killer created a social explosion. The press, magnifying every brutal detail, turned the murders into a public referendum on the moral and institutional failures of Victorian London. The environment of 1888 was not merely a backdrop, it was the essential condition that allowed Jack the Ripper to become the immortal symbol of absolute, unchallenged terror. The general terror that gripped Whitechapel, Part 2, was founded not just on the fact that women were being killed, but on the horrifying, evolving signature the killer was leaving behind. The subsequent murders, following the immediate shock of the double event, provided the gruesome, undeniable omen. This was not a desperate common criminal or a madman lashing out. This was a methodical, systematic butcher operating with unique, specialized knowledge. The killer was actively communicating his identity through the precise surgical brutality inflicted upon the victims. The transition from the crude throat cutting of the initial victims to the extensive abdominal mutilation seen in later cases, such as Annie Chapman and Catherine Eddowes, was chillingly rapid. These later crimes were characterized by a level of anatomical precision that stunned the medical community. The medical reports of the time were filled with bewildered shock. The extent of the internal damage and the manner in which specific organs, the uterus, a kidney were removed and often taken from the scene, suggested that the killer possessed far more than casual knowledge of human anatomy. He was operating with the skill, or at least the cold confidence, of someone trained in dissection. This surgical precision was the defining omen that caused the greatest institutional conflict. Scotland Yard was prepared to hunt a savage, but they were not prepared to hunt a potential surgeon, doctor, or butcher who was using the human body as a grotesque canvas. The killer's signature was a challenge to the entire medical establishment. The removal of the organs was not random. It was a deliberate, terrifying statement. This was not a necessary act to ensure the victim's death. It was a profound act of disrespect and psychological dominance performed after death. The fact that the killer was able to perform such methodical, extensive work in the dark, fog-choked alleys, Part 2, under the constant threat of discovery, reinforced the terrifying truth of his cold-blooded confidence. He was spending considerable time at the crime scene, completely unafraid of the law enforcement closing in. The institutional response was paralyzed by the very sophistication of the violence. Police looked for the obvious signs of struggle or flight, but the medical evidence pointed toward patience, knowledge, and ritual. The press, fueled by this gruesome and unprecedented surgical detail, amplified the horror, creating the iconic image of the killer. The newspapers were reporting the unbelievable fact that a monster was stalking the slums, a monster who was surgically proficient. This public amplification ensured that the fear was not just physical, but psychological. The killer's signature was a terror that preyed not just on the victims, but on the stability of the entire society, forcing the world to accept the possibility that a professional, educated man could be committing these atrocities in the shadows of the city. The meticulousness of the mutilations served as the final terrible piece of evidence that this was a psychological game of control, and the killer's rules were written in the blood of his victims. The shock of the double murder, Part 1, and the surgical signature of the killer, Part 3, demanded a response of unparalleled professionalism. Instead, Scotland Yard delivered an unprecedented failure, allowing the very system designed to catch the killer to become his unintentional accomplice. This institutional collapse was not the fault of individual laziness. It was the failure of the Gaslight-era policing to adapt to a modern psychological predator. The police's immediate profound mistake was the destruction of the crime scenes, a consequence of systemic incompetence and the immediate psychological need to rationalize the anomaly as something manageable. The first, and most catastrophic failure occurred at the scenes themselves. In 1888, the concept of forensic crime scene preservation simply did not exist. At the time of the murders, particularly the brutal killing of Catherine Eddowes in Mitre Square, the crime scene was immediately and uncontrollably contaminated. Uniformed officers, curious bystanders, and excited reporters were allowed to walk freely through the streets and, in some cases, directly into the rooms or yards where the bodies lay. They left behind footprints, mixed fibers, and destroyed any minute trace of physical evidence the killer might have left. The police were searching for the obvious, a weapon, a piece of clothing, while destroying the subtle, invisible biological evidence that would be crucial decades later. This lack of control turned the crime scenes into chaotic public spectacles, guaranteeing that when the professional investigators finally arrived, the forensic slate had been wiped clean, not by the killer's meticulousness, but by the police's own hands. This institutional failure was rooted in the police's rigid methodology. Scotland Yard was still operating under principles suited for common brawls, theft, and domestic violence, crimes that relied heavily on eyewitness accounts and public statements. They were completely unprepared for a serial killer who was highly intelligent, organized, and specifically targeted victims who had no protection and were often too afraid or too desperate to cooperate. The police assumed they were looking for a brute whose motive was sexual violence, not a meticulous mind whose motive was psychological performance. Part 3. This misreading of the killer's intent paralyzed their ability to think forensically. The most infamous example of this investigative incompetence occurred with the Goulston Street graffito, a key point we explore later in Part 6. Following the murder of Catherine Eddowes, a blood-stained piece of her apron was found near a wall that bore a message written in chalk. The message, which seemed to link the killer to a specific ethnic or religious group, was an explosive piece of evidence. However, before the message could be adequately photographed or scientifically documented, the police commissioner ordered it immediately wiped away. The reasoning was simple but devastating. The authorities feared the message would incite anti-Semitic riots in the already volatile Whitechapel area. Their political concern for public order superseded the forensic preservation of a vital clue. This decision was the ultimate illustration of the failure of the Gaslight era, the priorities of public management completely overriding the necessities of modern criminal investigation, guaranteeing the loss of one of the few pieces of evidence that could have been linked directly to the killer. Furthermore, the investigative resources were cripplingly fragmented. Different divisions and often different detectives were assigned to different victims, creating silos of information. There was no effective centralized system for sharing patterns, signatures, or minute details across the divisions. The rudimentary nature of the record-keeping and the fierce interdepartmental rivalry meant that the killer was essentially fighting a decentralized, uncoordinated opponent. This systemic fragmentation provided the killer with precious time and operational space, allowing him to perfect his signature and psychological game without fear of an immediate, unified response. The police's failure to rapidly connect the brutal surgical signature across the 5 canonical murders ensured that the Ripper remained ahead of the investigation until he ultimately chose to stop. The legacy of the Ripper case is thus profoundly defined by the institutional inability of 19th century law enforcement to adapt to a 20th century psychological killer. The failure to adapt to the anonymity and methodical nature of the Ripper guaranteed that the case would remain an eternal mystery. The systemic failures of the police, Part 4, the inability to preserve the crime scenes and the struggle to unify the fractured investigation were immediately exploited by the killer. If law enforcement was unable to track him in the shadows of Whitechapel, he would force them to acknowledge his presence through the glare of the press. This strategic move arrived in the form of a handwritten letter, addressed simply "Dear Boss." The letter, which reached the Central News Agency on September 27, 1888, was not merely a confession. It was the ultimate chilling act of psychological warfare, the killer's first direct dialogue with the world. The language of the letter was audacious, arrogant, and mocking. The author boasted about his exploits, detailing his enjoyment of the crimes and revealing an utter contempt for the police's inability to catch him. He openly threatened further violence, treating the murder spree not as a crime to be concealed, but as a performance to be judged. This communication was the polar opposite of a criminal begging for mercy. It was a figure demanding fame and recognition. The initial institutional reaction from Scotland Yard was one of profound skepticism and dismissal. In an era where sensational crimes often attracted dozens of hoaxes, the police immediately classified the Dear Boss letter as a probable fake, the work of a cheap sensation seeker capitalizing on the public fear. This dismissal was a necessary psychological defense for the overwhelmed authorities. Accepting the letter as genuine would mean accepting that the killer was educated, conscious of the investigation, and actively mocking them. They initially buried the letter, believing its publication would only encourage further madness. However, the subsequent terrifying reality forced their hand. Following the double murder of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, Part 1, the urgency to find a new explanation was immense. When certain details from the letter, particularly a veiled reference to cutting off the ears of a victim, seemed to align with the state of the later bodies, the police were plunged into a crisis of doubt. The question shifted from "is it real?" to "what if it is?" The most enduring and ultimately most successful component of the letter was the signature, Jack the Ripper. This moniker, coined either by the killer himself or quickly adopted by the press who first received the letter, was a stroke of genius in psychological marketing. It immediately replaced the victims' names and their tragic stories with the terrifying persona of the killer. The name Jack the Ripper was a powerful, easy-to-remember brand of terror that dominated the newspapers and public consciousness, turning the killer into an anonymous celebrity. The police were forced to acknowledge and chase a phantom persona, ensuring they would always be playing catch-up with the narrative the killer had created. This strategic move solidified the omen, Part 3 of the surgical precision. The killer was telling the public he was a methodical professional, a ripper, not a random brute. The content of the letter, regardless of its original authorship, became the template for subsequent communication, including the notorious Saucy Jackie postcard and the From Hell letter, further solidifying the persona. The dialogue established by Dear Boss was one of command. The killer commanded the press to publish, commanded the police to chase shadows, and commanded the public to fear. This sustained psychological pressure was the ultimate act of control, ensuring that the terror of the late 19th century was defined not by the names of the victims who suffered in the fog, but by the arrogant, taunting signature of the unseen man who hunted them. The psychological warfare waged by the killer through the press, Part 5, was matched by the physical confusion left on the streets. Following the terrifying double event, the murders of Stride and Eddowes, the police received an immediate, crucial piece of physical evidence that tracked the killer's flight path. Yet this clue remains one of the most frustrating failures in the history of the case. Hours after the body of Catherine Eddowes was found in Mitre Square, a blood-stained piece of her leather apron was discovered lying near a doorway on Goulston Street, several blocks away. This was the first firm forensic link establishing the killer's direction of escape from the city and back into the dense labyrinth of Whitechapel. However, the true paradox, the core of this baffling evidence, was the writing found chalked on the brickwork above the apron piece. The message was ambiguous but politically explosive. It contained specific references that seemed to blame a Jewish community for the ongoing crimes. The writing, which remains one of the most hotly debated elements of the case, immediately created an immense conflict within the police command. The central issue was not the authenticity of the message, but its immense volatility. In 1888, Whitechapel was already a tinderbox of social and economic resentment, frequently erupting in anti-immigrant and anti-Semitic sentiment. The police, led by Metropolitan Police Commissioner Sir Charles Warren, instantly realized the message could ignite massive, deadly riots. The police were forced to choose between two conflicting duties: preserving a vital piece of homicide evidence or preventing immediate public chaos and potential bloodshed. The decision made was catastrophic for the investigation. Commissioner Warren, prioritizing immediate public order over forensic integrity, ordered the message to be immediately wiped away before it could be properly photographed, documented, or scientifically analyzed by experts. This single fatal executive decision was the ultimate illustration of the failure of the gaslight era. The political imperative completely superseded the investigative necessity, guaranteeing the permanent loss of a potentially crucial clue. The lack of standard forensic protocol meant that the fleeting, visual record provided by the officers on the scene was all that remained. This paradox, the immediate destruction of evidence, is why the Goulston Street graffito remains the most maddening piece of the Ripper puzzle. Was the writing truly left by the killer as a final, cruel flourish, establishing his own warped political motive for the crime? Or was it simply pre-existing local graffiti that the killer's discarded apron piece coincidentally lay beneath? The police, in their panic, eliminated any possibility of scientifically determining the truth. Had they possessed the technology of a later era, the message could have been preserved, allowing linguists and forensic experts to study the handwriting and the chalk composition. Instead, the investigation was left with mere recollections from exhausted constables, creating an enduring ambiguity that has fueled conspiracy theories for over a century. The message was physically removed, but the institutional stain of that decision remains. The governing forces actively destroyed a direct line to the killer, sealing their own failure to adapt to the psychological demands of the case. The chalked message, though no longer physically present, became the ultimate symbol of the investigation's systemic incompetence. The procedural failures, the loss of the crucial Goulston Street message, Part 6, and the inability of the antiquated police system to cope with a psychological predator were mere antecedents to the killer's most devastating act of dominance. The true turning point of the entire Jack the Ripper saga occurred on the cold morning of November 9, 1888, with the murder of Mary Jane Kelly. This crime was a radical, terrifying escalation that immediately signaled to Scotland Yard that the killer had reached the climax of his psychopathic ritual and that the entire foundation of their investigation was fatally flawed. Mary Kelly was the youngest of the canonical victims, and crucially, she was the only one murdered indoors, in the privacy of her own small room at 13 Miller's Court. This shift in location was the ultimate, defiant statement of the killer's confidence. For months, the police had banked on catching the Ripper in the act on a dark street or alleyway. The move indoors proved the killer was so certain of his safety and the incompetence of the police that he felt comfortable securing himself inside a small room for an extended period. The condition of the scene was horrifying, even by the Ripper's already brutal standards. Because the attack took place inside, shielded from the immediate fear of discovery that defined the outdoor murders, the killer had virtually unlimited time to carry out his terrible ritual. The mutilations were extensive, graphic, and performed with a horrifying artistry that confirmed the medical theories regarding the killer's anatomical knowledge. Part 3. The sight that greeted the investigators defied description, forcing the police to confront the full, devastating reality of the killer's pathology. The police concluded that the killer must have spent hours inside the small room, methodically carrying out his gruesome work. This fact alone, the sustained presence of the killer at the scene for a prolonged period, was the final, insurmountable proof that the entire police effort was a catastrophic failure. The killer had successfully mocked the investigation by operating under a self-imposed period of safety, proving he was protected not by the darkness of the street but by the sheer, institutional chaos he had generated in Whitechapel. The murder of Mary Kelly was the final execution, marking the peak of the Ripper's psychological dominance. It was the moment the game changed, forcing the police to stop relying on luck and recognize that their reliance on traditional foot patrols and quick discovery was obsolete. The investigation suddenly faced the realization that the killer was likely blending seamlessly into the local community, perhaps even living within sight of his victims' homes. The ensuing days were marked by a desperate, massive dragnet operation. The police were finally mobilized, recognizing the gravity of the indoor escalation. But the sheer volume of time the killer had to clean himself, dispose of his instruments, and return to his normal life rendered the search useless. The physical evidence that might have been preserved indoors was compromised by the rudimentary forensic standards of 1888, Part 4, and the trail was hopelessly cold. This ultimate escalation led to an equally abrupt and significant event: the silence. Following the devastating brutality of the Mary Kelly murder, the canonical attack stopped entirely. This immediate cessation was the killer's final, most successful act of control. He proved that he could start the reign of terror, escalate it to the point of unparalleled brutality, And then, when the attention was at its highest and the pressure was at its peak, he could simply choose to stop, vanishing back into the suffocating fog of London on his own terms. The Ripper's victory was cemented by his ability to maintain absolute control over the timeline, ensuring that his final, devastating psychological statement was the last word the public would ever hear from him. The abrupt, devastating silence that fell over Whitechapel following the murder of Mary Kelly, Part 7, did not signal the end of the crisis. It signaled the beginning of the investigation's most agonizing phase. The killer's retreat was complete, but the terror he generated remained, and that psychological vacuum was immediately filled by a chaotic, overwhelming flood of public speculation, hoaxes, and false confessions. This marked the definitive crisis for the police. They were no longer fighting a physical killer in the fog, but a phantom persona that was being shaped and protected by the sheer volume of public imagination. The police, already exhausted by the systematic failures of the previous months, Part 4, were paralyzed by this deluge of information. Detectives assigned to the case were forced to vet thousands of irrelevant tips that poured in from all corners of the globe. Every man who wore a dark coat, owned a surgical instrument, or walked quickly through the fog became a target of suspicion. This created an immediate destructive conflict. The investigation had to chase every sensational, time-consuming lead to appease the frantic public, thereby draining all remaining resources from the crucial forensic work. The police were spending immense manpower checking the alibis of minor offenders, drifters, and unstable individuals who were merely seeking notoriety by inserting themselves into the Ripper's dark legend. This institutional failure to distinguish fact from myth guaranteed that the core, factual clues would remain buried under noise. The chaos led to the immediate creation of two dominant categories of suspects, both of which consumed years of investigation without result. The first was the royal and professional theory, fueled entirely by the surgical precision noted by the medical examiners, Part 3. This theory focused the police on educated upper-class individuals, doctors, barristers, or members of the aristocracy, such as Montague John Druitt, or, in the most sensational public theories, even members of the royal family. These theories were often unprovable, relying on rumor and class resentment, but they were seized upon by the media because they offered a narrative that contrasted the victim's social standing with the killer's supposed elite status. The police were forced to expend resources checking the movements and alibis of prominent citizens, a significant diversion from the brutal reality of the Whitechapel streets. The second category was the local and marginal theory, focusing on barbers, butchers, and local madmen, individuals with plausible proximity and access to knives or sharp instruments. This theory was factually grounded in the environment, yet equally hampered by the lack of clear evidence. Suspects like Aaron Kosminski or Severin Kwasowski were tracked intensely, but the contamination of the original crime scenes, Part 4, meant that the circumstantial evidence, though strong, could never be definitively tied to any single individual. The inability of the police to provide a clean, scientific case against anyone in this category only amplified the public's perception of institutional incompetence. The true crisis was the loss of control over the narrative. The silence after Mary Kelly was meant to signal that the killer had won, but the public refused to let the story die. Instead, they took over the investigation, generating an overwhelming shadow army of suspects that the police were legally bound to investigate. Detectives who had fought in the shadows of the foggy alleys now fought against the overwhelming paperwork and the endless parade of false confessions and sensational accusations. The investigation was effectively suspended, not by a formal institutional decision, but by sheer exhaustion and the final, crushing realization that the killer's anonymity was permanently secured by the very magnitude of the cultural fear he had inspired. The Ripper was no longer a man. He was an enduring shadow, an immortal symbol of the system's failure to adapt and manage the chaos of its own making. The chaos of the investigation, Part 8, proved that fighting the psychological shadow of the Ripper was impossible. The solution, if one existed, lay not in the deluge of suspects but in the grim physical facts that the killer had carelessly left behind. The true revelation of the Jack the Ripper case is found in a single, simple, and tragically overlooked piece of clothing: the apron. This item was a direct link to the killer's operational life and became the key to the rule of the white apron, the professional identity the killer successfully concealed. The police, overwhelmed by the sensational claims of aristocratic killers and foreign anarchists, failed to recognize that the clearest evidence pointed directly toward the working-class trades of Whitechapel itself. The initial clue, though politically destroyed, was Catherine Edhouse's apron piece found at Goulston Street, Part 6. But the forensic significance was much broader. The surgical nature of the cuts, Part 3, suggested the killer was accustomed to handling large tissue and organs, a skill commonly practiced by butchers, slaughterers, or leather workers, many of whom wore leather or white aprons as part of their trade uniform. This simple garment was the physical signature that tied the killer not to a distant mental asylum or royal palace, but to the very slaughterhouses, tanneries, and markets near the murder sites. The revelation, therefore, was not a person, but a profession and a location. The tragedy of the investigation was its institutional blindness to this factual evidence. The police were fixated on the sensational, the educated gentlemen and the foreign anarchists, believing that only a man of high status could possess such surgical skill. This class bias was the final fatal error. They were looking up at the elite when they should have been looking horizontally, across the street, into the businesses of the working class. The rule of the white apron was that the killer had a job, a legitimate reason for carrying a long, sharp knife, and a plausible need to clean large amounts of blood from his working clothes. This daily routine provided the killer with a perfect cover story, a way to disappear seamlessly back into the crowded streets after committing the murders. His tools were not surgical instruments stolen from a hospital. They were the tools of his trade, used under the cover of the industrial fog, Part 2. This revelation anchors the killer to the gritty, physical reality of the East End. It confirms the likelihood that the killer lived or worked within a very short distance of the murder sites, allowing him to flee, quickly wash up, and return to his legitimate life with minimal suspicion. The perfect, controlled routine that baffled the police. The institutional failure to prioritize the trade angle over the aristocratic rumors guaranteed the perpetuation of the mystery. The clue was staring them in the face, a silent testament to the killer's working-class connection to the violent, bloody reality of the slaughterhouses surrounding Whitechapel. The fact that the victims were targeted on dark, foggy nights only reinforced the killer's procedural awareness. He understood that his trade provided the cover for the knife and his knowledge provided the surgical precision. The environment provided the perfect, soundless operating theater. The evidence of the apron, the trade, and the location, though never fully connected in 1888, remains the single most reliable revelation that modern investigation has unearthed, offering a chilling final portrait of the professional killer who used the absolute chaos of poverty and prejudice as his ultimate shield. The murders stopped, but the investigation did not end with an arrest. It ended with a whisper of institutional defeat, the immediate aftermath of the Mary Kelly murder, Part A, and the climax of the killer's brutality, forced the British government into its ultimate legal act of survival. The primary legal mechanism of the time, the coroner's inquest, was immediately convened for each canonical victim. These were not trials designed to determine guilt, but public forums designed to determine the cause of death. Yet they became massive, sensationalized events, packed with reporters, medical experts, and frantic citizens. The inquests served only to officially confirm the brutality of the killer's surgical signature, adding layer upon layer of gruesome detail to the public record, but failing utterly to deliver a name. The sheer volume of contradictory testimony from witnesses who operated under the murky gaslight of Whitechapel was often useless, further cementing the chaos that had plagued the investigation since the beginning. Following the devastating silence after Mary Kelly, Scotland Yard faced an impossible administrative and psychological burden. The killer's abrupt withdrawal was his final, most effective tactical move. The investigation had been operating under the assumption that the killer would continue his spree until caught. His decision to stop proved his total control over the timeline. The police were left with vast amounts of useless paperwork, thousands of unverified witness statements, and the overwhelming financial strain of the exhaustive surveillance and fruitless house-to-house searches that followed the crimes. The realization became stark. They were no longer searching for a known presence. They were maintaining files on a ghost. The formal survival action taken by the institutional authorities was the slow, painful process of suspending the active hunt. This was not a public acknowledgement of failure, but a practical necessity. There was simply nothing left to chase. The investigation had been paralyzed by the conflicting evidence, the royal suspects versus the white apron profile, and the systematic destruction of the crime scenes, Part 4, meant that the forensic slate had been wiped clean. The police lacked the technology, the fingerprinting techniques and DNA analysis that would later become standard, to break the killer's self-imposed shield of anonymity. The failure was a direct indictment of the Victorian-era policing method's inability to adapt to the methodical, psychological demands of the Ripper's unique style of murder. The inquests and subsequent closure of the active case left a profound public and institutional scar. For the public, the silence was not success. It was a constant, terrifying reminder that a monster had lived among them, had been known by sight by dozens of people, Part 8, and had ultimately beaten the law. The institutional verdict was that the Ripper had won the war of attrition. The police were unable to transition from chasing sensational rumors to focusing on the subtle professional clue of the white apron trade, Part 9. The police files remained open, but the active hunt for the man who murdered the women of Whitechapel was over, destined to be relegated to the archives, awaiting a future generation with better technology to attempt to solve the ultimate cold case. The final price of justice was not paid by the killer, but by the victims, whose names were lost to history while the brutal pseudonym of their killer achieved immortality. The institutional failure of 1888, Part 10, relegated the Jack the Ripper case to the archives, but the enduring terror it inspired ensured the investigation was never truly over. The legacy of the Ripper is that his successful evasion became the very foundation for modern forensic science and criminology. Decades after the active hunt was suspended, criminologists and behavioral analysts began to apply new technologies to the old, bloody maps of Whitechapel, seeking the invisible patterns that the antiquated police force had missed. This pursuit led to the discovery of the killer's operational code, the unwritten scientific principles that guaranteed his escape, the secret 13th rule. This rule was not found in a diary or a letter. It was found in the geography and the timing of the violence. The first crucial application of modern technique was geographical profiling. The police of 1888 viewed the 5 canonical murders as isolated incidents linked only by the savage signature, Part 3. Modern analysis, however, proved that the killer adhered to an incredibly strict pattern of proximity. When plotted on a map, the 5 murder sites form a tight, specific cluster, a precise hunting zone that barely spanned a single square mile. This demonstrated the killer's unwavering adherence to the rule of proximity. He did not travel randomly. He walked or cycled short distances, ensuring he could quickly retreat to his normal life and dispose of his bloody clothing without ever crossing significant police boundaries or venturing far from his home or workplace, reinforcing the white apron theory, Part 9. This analysis revealed that the killer was protected not by cunning disguises, but by his mundane routine. The 1888 police looked for a grand escape route. The modern answer lay in a simple, short walk home. The second piece of analysis focused on behavioral timing. The Ripper attacks were concentrated specifically during the late hours of the weekend, Friday and Saturday nights, or on public holidays. This meticulous timing strongly suggested that the killer was constrained by a regular work schedule, providing him with necessary operational windows of time when he knew he would not be missed or scrutinized. This behavioral detail reinforced the profile of a contained, methodical individual who held a legitimate working-class job. He was not a wandering anarchist or a reckless aristocrat. He was someone ruled by the clock. This insight was critical, as it completely contradicted the sensational high society theories that had consumed the original resources. Part 8. The killer's rule was simple: never violate the schedule. These modern insights merged to define the secret 13th rule. The killer's operational survival depended entirely on the predictable systemic failures of the police. The rule states that the killer relied on the institutional inability to connect the geographical dots. The failure to prioritize forensic evidence over public order, Goulston Street, Part 6, and the simple fact that a single, disciplined individual could defeat a large, antiquated police force through psychological control and operational restraint. The 13th rule was the principle of perfection in anonymity. This scientific discovery, made decades too late, confirms the original psychological profile. The killer was highly intelligent, organized, and ultimately, his success was procedural, not magical. The files of 1888 were solved by the science of the future, decades after the killer had already claimed his final victory and vanished into the fog. The case of Jack the Ripper is not a story of an unsolved crime. It is the definitive story of institutional failure and the terrifying, enduring power of anonymity. We have followed the terror from the chaos of the double event to the ultimate cessation of the attacks, Part 7, and the heartbreaking acknowledgement that the active investigation was suspended by exhaustion, not resolution, Part 10. The final verdict of history is unambiguous. The killer won. The Ripper's victory was not accidental. It was procedural and psychological, a direct result of his meticulous planning and the institutional inability of Victorian London to adapt. The failure lay in the police's outdated methodology, Part 4. The initial political decision to destroy critical physical evidence like the Goulston Street message, Part 6, and the systemic class bias that looked for the killer among the aristocracy, rather than the tradesmen, the rule of the white apron, Part 9. The police were defeated because the killer understood the rules of the environment, the suffocating fog, the chaos of poverty, better than the men who were sworn to police it. The most profound element of the Ripper's legacy is the lasting scar left on the city of London and the permanent fame achieved through his absence. The killer proved that terror could be generated, sustained, and abruptly concluded entirely on his own terms. The ultimate rule of the 13th rule, Part 11, was simply maintain operational restraint, never extend the risk beyond the immediate hunting zone, and allow the system's own incompetence to secure your silence. The Ripper's anonymity became his immortality. Because he was never identified, he remains a canvas for every dark possibility. He could have been a doctor, a barrister, or the simple butcher who worked 2 blocks from Miller's Court. This ambiguity ensures that the mystery never dies, feeding the public's need to chase the shadow. The game never ends because the police never got the final move. The final silent retreat of the killer after the murder of Mary Kelly was his ultimate act of control, leaving behind an institutional vacuum. Decades of subsequent investigations, forensic breakthroughs, and technological advancements have failed to close the case because the killer's meticulousness in 1888, avoiding fingerprints, using perishable materials and relying on witness confusion, built a forensic shield that remains effective even against modern DNA analysis. The mystery of Jack the Ripper survives only through continuous active public engagement. It is a terrifying testament to the power of a killer who achieved permanent celebrity status through his terrifying surgical signature, but ultimately secured his permanent victory through the system's inability to adapt to the anonymity he created. The story will endure as long as the question remains open. The final truth of the Jack the Ripper case is that the terror was real, and the failure was human. The killer escaped justice, and the greatest question left for history is not who he was, but why he chose to stop. What is your final verdict? After analyzing the evidence of the surgical cuts and the rule of the white apron, do you believe the police were looking at the wrong social class, and that the killer was a local tradesman protected by the chaos of the London fog? Or do you believe the silence means he simply vanished, having achieved his goal? Let me know your strongest theories and insights in the comments below. Your analysis is what keeps the investigation alive. If you dare to continue exploring the ultimate unsolved failures of history in the minds of psychological predators, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. This is Mr. Nightmare, and the game continues.